So I appreciate being here. You have such a distinguished panel. So I know you've heard a lot of interesting insight into the challenges we face with regards to Russia. What I thought I would do briefly is just kind of give you my view of the internal debate that we're having. And it really extends beyond just the issue of treaties and violations of them, but a couple points that perhaps were made already. The first is it's interesting to note that the Russians have basically violated every major treaty they've ever entered into. Certainly every major weapons treaty they've ever entered into. I think their view has traditionally been that they're for these things as long as they're good for them, and then when they're not good for them, they decide maybe they want to follow them, maybe they don't. And I think to understand modern-day Russia, what we're viewing now, you have to understand Vladimir Putin's worldview. And his worldview is, and he's declared this a few years ago in an interview that he did, he believes the most catastrophic event of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think it's a sentiment that's shared among some in Russian society, that this nostalgic wish to reestablish Russian power in the world. That's what the Soviet Union allowed them to do for an extended period of time. And so you have to view it through that lens, and he has decided that in order to be able to reclaim that mantle, he has to be an aggressor against the U.S. and U.S. foreign policy interests. Now, internally, he has shown his authoritarian streak. It's part of a broader phenomenon around the world that we're viewing people get elected, but they don't govern as Democrats. And by the way, even the execution of those elections don't necessarily show strong democratic tendencies. So I would submit to you that just because you have an election does not make you a democratic country if, in order to carry out those elections, for example, you're oppressing alternative points of view in the media, you're making it very difficult for opposition groups to operate, you're cutting off access to international information to your voting populace. You see all these sorts of things occurring in Russia, again, because of an authoritarian lean that government clearly has under Putin. You translate that now to their activities on the international stage vis-a-vis the United States and the world. On issue after issue, Russia is consistently, under Putin, on the side of the oppressors and the tyrants, on every single issue. So who was one of the greatest benefactors and supporters of Assad? Putin's Russia. Who was one of the people that has given Iran cover in international forums? Russia. So in the framework that I've just laid out to you, that's how you have to analyze how it is they enter these negotiations for weapons and for treaties. And their view of it is that they do not want and will not agree to anything that diminishes their ability to intimidate and or control the neighboring countries in their region and extend their power around the world. They have such limited capabilities economically to sustain a conventional weapons force that the only place where they have a strategic advantage in terms of getting the most return on investment is through the development of missile technologies and their nuclear weapons. And what's most concerning to me about that is that in a time in the world where virtually of all the acknowledged nuclear powers on the planet, the only ones who have ever seriously talked about actually downsizing their own capabilities have been the U.S. and the U.K. Not even the French are interested in that. Certainly the Indians and the Pakistanis are not interested in that. The Russians and the Chinese are modernizing their capabilities. And the U.S. seems stuck in this idea that somehow we can lead by example. So you heard the President recently talked about lowering our capabilities to 1,000 strategic weapons because we're going to lead by example. Somehow Putin is going to follow our example and do the same. Well, that's proven not to be true. And in fact, the opposite is happening. So laying all that out, I would say that you go into these negotiations or you go into these talks with the notion that somehow they have the same goals that we do, and that's not accurate. I think their goals are very clear: to maintain their weapons capabilities in a way that furthers their desire to be a dominant power at our expense if possible, and to diminish our capabilities in return. And I think that is an important distinction that I'm not sure is shared by enough people in the State Department. The view that I get when I interact with people in the State Department on some of these things is that the fact that we're even talking to them is a sign of progress. The fact that we're even talking is in and of itself a victory. And I don't think that's an accurate, I think it's a very dangerous worldview, quite frankly, to have. So it's not surprising that we recently saw in the New York Times and in other media outlets reports that the Russians are in violation of the intermediate missile agreements, something that now appears the U.S. government knew for a significant period of time. In fact, something the U.S. government should have known if it didn't when we entered the New START treaties. And yet those things seem to be swept under the rug. Our allies are not informed about this. And this somehow doesn't come into any of the calculations we undertake as we enter these conversations and negotiations. And the most critical part about this is what it does to U.S. credibility. Now, I've had the opportunity to travel abroad over the last few years and in the last few months. And while our hosts are too polite to come out and say it, there are real question marks about U.S. credibility, about the credibility of our defense agreements, and about the credibility of our foreign policy. Is the U.S. under this administration willing and capable to fulfill its historic commitments that it has made to the security of the world? And there are real question marks about that around the world. And in light of those question marks, countries are beginning to calculate they're going to have to go it alone and on their own. They're going to have to do these things by themselves. And you're seeing evidence of that everywhere. And so when news like this filters out, that the Russians are in violation of an agreement, but the U.S. either didn't address it with them and certainly didn't inform our partners until it was about to break, and doesn't seem to have a strategy to address this, and in fact is talking about new agreements with the Russians, despite their history of violating every previous agreement, that only lets credence to the notion that the U.S. is, quite frankly, under this president and under this administration, an unreliable partner, and one that's not credible. And I think that has dangerous repercussions, because in the absence of U.S. leadership, these vacuums are being filled, and they're being filled by state and non-state actors who have a very different view of what the world should look like, and certainly not one that reflects the majority of the American people, or quite frankly, the majority of the world. Everywhere I've traveled abroad, and clearly it's been with countries we have strong alliances, in South Korea and Japan and the UK, everywhere I go, what our allies want, the number one question on their mind, they're polite in how they state it, is America today the same America that we partnered with over the last 50 years? Or have you reached the point now where you have a political leadership that doesn't see the value and doesn't have the dedication to America's historic role on the planet? And you're seeing the outlines of what that means already in places like Syria, and unfortunately in other places now that are emerging as well. So I have real concerns moving forward about what this administration hopes to accomplish for the following reason. The president has stated that he wants to see the world be free of nuclear weapons, which I think is an ideal notion that is completely unrealistic and, quite frankly, very dangerous, in the sense that no time in our lifetime will any of these global nuclear powers disarm. No nation on earth that has these capabilities is going to walk away from their own capabilities. And if U.S. capabilities diminish beyond a certain threshold, you are basically inviting, and in many cases forcing, other nations to now all of a sudden have to perhaps consider a capability of their own. If, for example, the U.S. capability it continues to degrade because we don't modernize and in fact have a president talking about lowering our capabilities, what is to say that in 20 or 25 years or less, the South Koreans, the Japanese, in the case of Iran, the Saudis and others, may have to decide that in order to protect themselves, because they no longer feel that the U.S. nuclear assurances are credible, what is to say that these countries will not pursue programs of their own? And suddenly, in an effort to prevent proliferation, you are in fact creating an environment for massive proliferation, where numerous countries now believe that they have to do what the U.S. once did. So, again, I know that the topic here is Russian compliance with these nuclear agreements and these missile agreements, but in fact it goes to the heart of something much broader than just compliance. It goes to the credibility of the U.S. security arrangement. And if those are in doubt, countries will begin to do what's in their national interest, which may not necessarily be in furtherance of our own. So my last point is, what I am most troubled by in the 3 years that I've been here is almost congressional abdication of our constitutional role in setting foreign policy, congressional disinterest to some extent in being engaged in formulating foreign policy. I think that that's been there throughout our history, but I don't know if it's ever been more important, given the fact that we now have an administration here in the U.S. with a foreign policy view that is not strategic at all. It is completely guided by the idea that we're going to do everything the opposite of what George Bush did, in the sense that they entered office believing that the reason why these conflicts existed around the planet was because the United States was too involved and too engaged and too aggressive. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be more careful in picking our engagements and trying to avoid unnecessary ones. But, for example, I'm segueing a little bit, but I saw this weekend, Susan Rice was interviewed, and she argued about Syria. And what she said is, well, we're not going to do, what do some of these people want? We're not going to do what some of these people are saying about putting boots on the ground in Syria. I haven't heard a single U.S., maybe there's somebody out there that's argued that, but I haven't heard a single U.S. policymaker make that argument, certainly not on our side of the aisle. And yet, she went completely unchallenged when she made that statement. The same is the same questions we get with regards to Russia. Well, we have to talk to them. They're important. We have to engage them. And I think that's generally true. But that engagement only works if you're both working towards the same goal. And the Russian goals for these negotiations and these talks and these treaties are very different than ours. Our goal is to make the world a safer place. Our goal is to make the world less likely to have a violent confrontation. Their goal is to increase their dominance over their neighbors and their geopolitical strength at our expense. And so that's how I think we need to be able to view this issue. Look, I don't think that we are destined to have conflict with China or Russia per se, but I do think that in an effort to de-escalate conflicts by appearing to be unreliable, inconsistent, and undedicated, as this administration seems to be in its foreign policy, we are actually creating the greater likelihood of an escalation in conflicts. I think weakness, I think instability in policymaking, I think a lack of a strategic vision actually invites miscalculation and aggressiveness. And so when I read those open source reports about Russian violations, and quite frankly, an administration that didn't seem to take that as a red line of any sort, now I'll use a term that's been misused quite a bit, I think that should be very concerning to all of us, because its impact goes well beyond that particular agreement. Its impact affects how other nations view us and the decisions that they make and the assumptions that they make about what's in their own national security if they believe the U.S. is no longer a reliable security partner. So again, I hope that there will be more congressional focus on these things. I happen to be the co-chair of the National Security Work Group, which is assigned to actually look at the compliance on these treaties and agreements. We've struggled to pull together meetings because of some internal jurisdictional disputes within the Senate about who should be in charge of what. But one of the areas that we continue to focus on is the argument that we should not be entering any more negotiations with the Russians on any weapons systems so long as they are openly violating. And I mean openly because all you got to do is read Russian media reports. All you have to do is read Russian media reports to understand that they are habitually violating multiple different agreements. So I hope that that will become a priority for us. We should take that more seriously than we do. And again, I congratulate you and thank you for holding this discussion, because at least someone's paying attention to this stuff, and we're glad you are.
Thank you. Questions for Senator Rubio?
But not all at once, please. I guess that was pretty comprehensive. Okay, well, good. Nobody has a question. Well, thank you. I appreciate the time you've given me today. You have a very distinguished panel. I'm sorry I missed it, but I'll watch it online, right? It'll be posted. Great. Thank you again for your interest in this topic. It really does matter. Maybe I'll just close by saying a couple little things that I wanted to add to my statement, but I didn't want to take away from the questions. The first is, I think we should be proud of what American foreign policy has achieved in the world. You know, the last century had 2 brutal world wars and then a number of conflicts that were spin-offs of the Cold War. And I think we should be proud. I'm not saying America always made every right decision on foreign policy, but I can tell you our motivations were always positive. And I think there's, if you look back at that history and what it's meant, if you look at the global progress that we've had, the number of people that no longer live in poverty, the rise of a global middle class, the growing number of democracies that we see around the planet, countries like South Korea that not so long ago had economies smaller than North Korea, and now instead of being an aid recipient is an aid donor, none of those things would have been possible had it not been for a strategic, well thought out and engaged bipartisan role for the United States in the world. What I worry about in the 20th century is that we've entered an era where perhaps there may be some retrenchment in that. And in particular, under this administration, with the notion that the job is to manage crisis as opposed to steer them towards outcomes that are not just better for us, but better for the planet. Our national interests at a global scale are the spread of freedom, democracy, liberty, and peace. Those are our strategic objectives. They always have been. We're not looking to invade and take over any countries. We're not looking for colonies. We're not looking to add a 51st state or a 52nd state. What we want is countries that are stable and peaceful so we can sell them things and they can sell us things. And we can invest over there and they can invest with us. Those things are very difficult to do when countries are in the middle of political upheavals or wars. And so what we view our role in the world is furthering these things. And I think it's important to compare that to how Russia views the world and how the Chinese view the world. But in this case, because the topic is Russia, how the Russians view the world and how their ambitions are for these sorts of things. Their ambitions are very different. Their ambitions are not to create peace, democracy, and stability on the world. Their ambitions are to grow their influence and their dominance over former republics, over their neighbors, to be able to hold countries hostage, whether it's because they're in range of their missiles or because they're dependent upon their natural gas exports. And so on issue after issue, they don't care if there are violations of human rights in the streets of Ukraine, so long as the violators happen to be people that are on their side. They don't care that Iran is threatening to destabilize the Middle East even further with a nuclear ambition, so long as that puts the U.S. at the defensive. They don't care that Assad is slaughtering people, so long as we're against it, they're for it. That's how they view these things. They, I mean Putin, because I don't believe that's where the majority of the Russian people are. And so when we enter any sort of talks about a negotiation, you have to understand who you're negotiating with and what their motives are and what they're motivated by. And I think that's really missing in this administration. I think what they're motivated by is a naive or perhaps a deliberate belief that somehow U.S. power and U.S. influence and U.S. engagement makes the world a more dangerous place rather than a safer one. I strongly disagree with that, as I hope you do as well, and I hope it will be able to play a greater role in guiding U.S. foreign policy in the future. So thank you for this invitation. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.